Hello, guys. Oh my fucking god, you bitch!
Wait, but don't you need some sort of an intro?
Yes, and it's still recording.
Okay. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. History and mythology are us. Go.
I'm keeping this. Okay, now that we're done with that brief sponsor break, everybody, brought to you by my lovely sister and editor. Okay, so guys, gals, and otherworldly pals, before we get into the video, I just want to state that nothing in this video is owned by me. It is strictly for educational and entertainment purposes only. So today we're going to be talking about the Norse creation myth, which it all starts with a man, a cow, and a block of ice. But before that, we need to get into the history. And I just heard the collective sigh. The history is important, trust me. It's just as important to the mythology and goes just hand in hand as gems or gold or preparation H in an asshole. You can never really have one without the other. Now, it's believed that through evidence, the Norse faith is at least 300 years older than the famous Viking Age. That was roughly around 790 CE to around 1100 CE. That being said, we're going to mostly be focusing on the Viking Age because that time period is more fairly documented than the 300 years before due to them becoming center stage of world history at that time. But with that, another disclaimer, not all the Norse were Vikings, and not all Vikings believed in the Norse faith, as during their exploits across Europe, they were introduced and slowly converted to Christianity. And it was even believed that some converted to Islam after they began using the Volga trade route. This route connected northern Europe and northwest Russia with the Caspian Sea and the Sassanian Empire, allowing them to trade with Muslim countries on the shore and sometimes even reaching as far inland as modern-day Baghdad. Unlike what is heavily believed and showed in popular media, the Vikings were actually not a singular race of people either. They didn't share the same ancestry or anything like that. It was more of a job title, like doctors, lawyers, or loan sharks, all people who like to steal your money, just like the Vikings did. The most well-known Vikings came from areas that we now know as Denmark, Norway, Sweden, though there were mentions in historical records of Finnish, Estonian, and Sami Vikings as well. The common thread that connected all of them, though, was that they were A, from a far-off land, B, were uncivilized in the eyes of the people they raided, and most importantly, they weren't Christian. So all in all, they were dirty, barbaric heathens that made all the ladies swoon. And for roughly the next 300 years, the Vikings raided, pillaged, blackmailed, traded, and also built settlements wherever and whenever they wanted. Many tried to fight back with some wins and losses on both sides, but all the while, the Vikings were starting to believe and convert to the faith of their victims. During the roughly 500 to 600 years of the Norse culture thriving, it was mostly an oral civilization. And I hear some of you cackling in the background, not that kind of oral. Thank you for my sound effects team. Over time, they did develop a writing system which was called runes, and the earliest known inscription of these come from around 150 on the oldest runestone ever found, whose name that is like 16 letters long, and I would murder if I even tried to, so I'm not going to. Google's a thing, look it up. Even though they had a written language, their myths were orally shared through skalds, the super way cooler way to call poets, or for you nerds, bards. You're welcome. Now, thanks to the people who listened to these tales and wrote them down, we still have some of the myths, though heavily fragmented, because sadly, with things that are being shared orally, if you missed the story from the last night, it would be really hard to understand why Thor is in a dress. Now, we're going to fast forward to the year 1066, because that marked the end of the Viking Age, as the last great Viking king, Harald Hardrada, I murdered that. We're going to move on. Not even going to talk about just of Norway, staged an invasion of England. He was defeated, and later that same year, William, Duke of Normandy, who was a descendant of Scandinavian settlers in France, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, he would later become known as William the Conqueror. He became crowned as King of England on Christmas Day of the very same year. Now, by this time, all of the Scandinavian kingdoms were Christian, and what little remained of their pagan beliefs were being slowly absorbed into the culture of Christian Europe. Now, if we do another time jump and we jump ahead to 150 years later to 1220, a man named Snorri Sturluson wrote what is called the Prose Edda, which tried to compile all that was still left into a cohesive story, but it was done through a very heavy Christian bias. And we still don't know how much of it is basically ancient fan fiction and what is actually canon to the Norse faith. Now, if we do a smaller time jump of about 50 years to the year 1270, when the Poetic Edda is written, and with it contains the Codex Regius, containing about 29 poems believed to have been preserved by unknown authors from the Skalds. These two works are where we get most of everything that we know about the Norse mythology. That is to say that just like in every other mythology, some myths do vary and change, and you can mix and match elements from each one and track how they evolved over time. It's not really the case with Norse mythology because we've lost all of that evolution. So now it's a lot of heavy guesswork and just trying to build off of the building blocks that we do have and hoping that the puzzle pieces fit. And working around not only what we're missing, but what might have been changed to fit a Christian Europe and its audience. And also trying to work off of and help make sense what pulp culture has also changed, because essentially everything that we see today in pulp culture is fan fiction of one kind or the other. Like, they didn't have horns on their helmets, and Loki is not Odin's son, and their gods were not called as guardians, okay? That was all not actually in the thing. But with that being said, now we understand the history of everything. We're going to transition into the actual story, which is the creation of the world through the eyes of the Norse, which is wild and crazy, and yeah. I hope you enjoy it. Let's jump right into it. Now, a quick disclaimer before we get into the actual tale. There are going to be some names and words in here that I will mispronounce. And for that, I apologize. I am trying my hardest to get everything as correct as possible. So I hope you all will bear with me while I do this. Before time, before space, before anything, there was just an endless void of nothing. It was filled with nothing but darkness and silence. The silence and chaos of true and pure nothingness. This was called Guten Gab, though eventually, at an unknown amount of time, two places did come into being. Either they formed from Guten Gab or they just came into being on their own. This is widely disputed, so we're not even going to get into it. To the north was Niflheim, a barren land, colder than a walk in freezer with its defrost turned off, and it was covered in a constant fog. It was the future home of the deceased and the goddess Hel, who was daughter of Loki. And it also was where one of the roots of the great tree Yggdrasil and the great dragon, or worm, depending on who wants to argue what it was a snake with wings. But, anyways, his name was Nidhogg, and he would chew on this root. But that's all in the future. For now, what's most important is that in the center of this frozen landscape is the spring Velgirmir, the source of all mythical rivers collectively called the Elvigar. To the south was Muspelheim, a land hotter than Arizona during a bright sunny summer's afternoon, and it was covered in volcanoes and rivers of lava. It later became home to the fire giants and their leader, Surtur, who will one day march his people across the Bifrost, breaking it on the day of Ragnarok. Now, in some versions of this tale, the cold winds of Niflheim and the warm winds of Muspelheim converged into the vast empty plains of Gutengab and formed the first being into life, Ymir, and the celestial cow Udamala. In other tales, the rivers that flow from the spring Virglimir flowed into Gutengab and formed large blocks of ice, with the warm winds flowing from Muspelheim and melting the ice, shaping both the first man and first cow. Once both beings were born, Ymir felt for the first time hunger, and so he grabbed that celestial udder and just started chugging like a kid with a Capri Sun on a hot day. This in turn made the poor cow hungry, so they began licking at the salty ice for nourishment. Once Ymir was full of that sweet, sweet celestial cow milk, he decided to take a nap. And while he slept, the first giants began to spring out of his armpits. Yeah, you heard me right, folks. But that's not even the end of it. Every time he would rub his legs together, more giants would be born. Over the course of 3 days, while Ymir was sucking all the milk out of his cow and sleeping and birthing children from his armpits and legs, Unamala was licking away at the ice until eventually they licked a man free. Now, this cow slobbered covered being was called Buri, the very first of the Aesir, the race of gods that we mostly see in pulp culture, even though some of who we see in pulp culture called Aesir are really from other races, but I digress. At some point, Buri had a son named Bor, and personally, given how we see other beings being born, I'd rather not think too deeply how he had his son. Bor then met and fell in love with the giantess Bestella. They got married and had 3 sons, Odin, Vili, and Vi. Yes, folks, even Odin, the All-Father, the king of the gods, and of the Aesir, was half giant. He also was not the father of Loki, so don't start with the Marvel fanfiction of Norse mythology. I swear, don't do it. Over time, the 3 sons of Buri decided that it was time for Ymir to take the longest nap of all time and set out to kill him. Now, to really put things into perspective for you, the Aesir was about the size of an average mortal, maybe a bit bigger, while the giants could well be anywhere from the size of mortals and what our brains would typically think of when we hear the word giant. Now, if you can imagine that the biggest giants were about the size of Godzilla, and then picture that Godzilla is an ant crawling on Ymir. That's how big this dude was, okay? And these three brothers were just slashing away at him, trying to kill him. And believe it or not, they actually did manage to kill him. But all the blood from the fighting caused a flood that killed all but two of the giants, who then later fled and settled in what would become Jotunheim, and were the ancestors of all the frost giants, including Loki. Once the brothers were sure that the life had left Ymir for good, they dragged his body to the center of Gutengab and began building the world. They took and tamed the floods of his blood and shaped them into the oceans, rivers, and lakes. They then pulled a Jeffrey Dahmer and ripped off his flesh and muscles and shaped them into the land and dirt. After that, they ripped out all of this dude's hair and planted it for all the plant life that we have now. That's right, folks. Every time you eat your veggies, you're really eating hair. You're welcome. After that, they ripped open his skull, shredded his brains, and then threw them into the air to create clouds. They then broke and reshaped his bones into the mountains. And then after that, they ripped out his teeth and ground them up and scattered them for rocks. And finally, they plucked out his eyelashes to create our home, Midgard. Now, while they were working on the world's most gruesome art project that not even the Addams family would touch, they noticed worms crawling out of Ymir's corpse. And then they watched as the worms took the shape of dwarves. That's right, they didn't pop out of holes in the ground, but holes in a dead body. Yeah, that one grossed me out too. We're just gonna move on from it. They chose four of them and handed them the top of Ymir's skull to hold up for the sky. Nordi went to the north, Vestri to the west, Sundri to the south, and Austri to the east, forever holding up the sky, aka this dude's skull. The rest of their people went underground and built the land of Svartalheim and became expert craftsmen, building such things as Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, his wife Sif's hair. Yeah, you heard that right, but that's another story for another time. Finally, they went to Muspelheim and threw the sparks there into the sky to create the stars. Feeling like they had finished a job well done, they left to begin building Asgard, their future home. Now, after an unknown amount of time, the brothers decided to take a walk on the beach, probably laughing and reminiscing about the time they killed their sweet daddy and killed all their cousins, when one of the brothers tripped over an ash tree log. Then one of the other brothers tripped over an elm tree log. Looking over the logs, the three brothers all agreed that they looked like a dude and a chick. And so Odin, in all his great wisdom, breathed spirit and life into the logs. V then gave them movement, a mind of their own, and intelligence. Vili, probably not wanting to be left out, cleaned up their shape a bit, gave them the ability to speak and feel, and finally gave them the five senses. Together, they named them Ask and Embla. They were the first man and woman to ever come into existence. Now, I will admit that I did leave something out of this tale so far, and that's because I found three conflicting stories on how we got the sun and the moon. And I suppose I could have just picked one and called it a day, or maybe even mashed parts of them together, but that also didn't really feel right. So I'm just going to tell you all three and let you decide which one you like best. And the easiest and fastest one to tell, the brothers went to Muspelheim, and when they were throwing up the sparks into the sky to create the stars, they found the two brightest ones and it fixed them to the sky. And wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, we have the sun and the moon. In another, there is a giant named Norvin who had a daughter whose name, meaning night, was Not. And she later had a son whose name, meaning day, was Dogger. They rode chariots in the sky, becoming the sun and moon, and they each had a horse pulling their chariots. Now, in probably the longest version, down in Midgard was a man named Mudilfari, and he had two children. A daughter who was bright and shining and in gold and glory and beautiful, and her name was Sol. And he also had a son who was equally bright and shining in silver, and his name was Manny. Now, the gods pulled a total Greek move here and got super pissy and super jealous that these two mortals that literally glowed in the dark could do that. So they just snatched them up and they gave the daughter a chariot pulled by two horses and a shield below her so that she didn't set the world on fire as she rolled through the sky. And they also gave the son a chariot, but he only got one horse and no really cool shield. And since this dude was taking notes and feeling totally left out, and he felt like he also needed more help, so he also went down to Midgard and snatched himself up some two more kids to be his helpers. And so the sun and the moon are kidnapped kidnappers sitting in the sky. And in all these versions, though, the sun and the moon are forever being chased by two giant wolves. Skoll, meaning treachery, and Hati, meaning hate. And every night, Hati gets angry and decides to eat a piece of the moon. But during the day, the moon heals itself. And this is a cycle that will repeat itself until Ragnarok's, when the wolves will finally get to catch up to them and eat them, just like I would if I had to chase a baked potato for all of time. And that's the end of our tale today. At some point, we'll dive deeper into more tales from this fascinating mythology. But just like Ragnarok, that's for a future that we don't know when it will happen yet. So, good night. Have a lovely morning, a nice chill afternoon. Remember, we're all vampires drinking Ymir's blood, eating his hair, and most importantly, remember to leave confusing diaries for future generations. Bye bye.